Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. From Iraq to Chile to Lebanon and many other countries, there have been massive protests with hundreds of thousands of people being mobilized, coming out on the streets. The year 2019 has been in many ways an iconic year for public demonstrations. But while each protest is unique, is there a common thread we see in all the protests around the world today? We take a closer look at this story. Joining us for this discussion is Leila Hatoum, a reporter at the Daily Star newspaper in Lebanon. She's joining us from Beirut. We're also joined by John Wight, the writer and political commentator, joining us from Aden in Bra. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. John, I'd like to begin with you. Now, many people would say we are living in the golden age for protests. Do you agree with that?
Well, I wouldn't describe it in those terms myself. I think people come into the streets. Most people don't want to be protesting. Most people just want to be able to get on with their lives. And in many respects, mass protests of the order that we are seeing around the world are taking place in conditions of extremist, economic dislocation, encroaching inequality, and manifesting in various issues around the world, whether it be human rights, whether it be in Hong Kong with the attempt to pass legislation allowing for extradition of residents of Hong Kong to mainland China, whether it be in France, the Gilets Jaunes Yellow Vest protests, which have been taking place since last November every weekend. And that was the proximate cause of that was the attempt by the Macron government to impose a fuel tax. So there are various symptoms, but underlying them all is economic inequality and the death, I contend, of this neoliberal global free market economic model.
Right. And I take your point there. And you've highlighted one of the essential points that we do want to bring into the conversation later on. What is that common thread that's running through all these protests we see today? And you're pointing towards economic discontent. But what I do want to get towards is these mass demonstrations we're seeing around the world. Are they happening in an unprecedented manner?
Yes, they are. And I think it's because social media plays a big role in allowing people to communicate with one another in a way that they were not able to in past before social media. So they're able to organise these mass demonstrations and get huge numbers out into the streets very quickly in response to events. So I think that is a key issue. Also, the means of communication where people are able to see what's going on around the world, and they're able to relate the experience of what they're seeing in other parts of the world to their own lived experience. So one protest inspires protests in other parts of the world. We saw the phenomenon of the Arab Spring, which inspired the Occupy movement in the US around 2011. So they are feeding into each other, and they're forging one connecting thread, and people are now finding their voice in a way that they haven't done since probably the 1960s.
Right. Leila, I'll go to you. After John has highlighted what he views as being unprecedented, something that's happening in a very surprising manner, but also an amazing manner, especially after the 1960s. Tell us what is happening in Lebanon right now.
Well, the whole thing started about 12 days ago, and it was mainly, as Mr. John said, economic strains that happened because of the economic global downturn that fed into the current weak economy in Lebanon, but it's also based on the social injustice that the Lebanese have been facing for the past 3 decades. I mean, the idea that there is no political reform, there is no social reform, and there is no economic reform. People have been taxed and taxed over and over again. And the politicians are the same the past 30 years, 28 years, they're still in power. They always speak about reform, but they never implement it. And every single time they go into elections, they just promise things that they never deliver. So by the time, end of last month, when the government convened to actually impose the taxes, impose new taxes on the people were fed up. And that was it. So it was the government's lack of action to address former promises and to address also former problems that are concurrent as well, be it social or be it economic, that pushed the people to the streets. Now, it started with a massive spontaneous movement by the youth, because we have a higher number of youth unemployment in Lebanon. It soon dragged other people, the educated people, the people who come from various backgrounds. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, everybody went down to the streets because they're fed up with their government. Slowly, we started seeing politicians and their political parties threatening people at one point or another that we're going to go towards void, because the people were asking for the government to resign and a change in the system, calling for new elections and to implement economic, basically, reforms. The party started threatening people at one point. They sent their own hooligans to the ground to beat up people. The Lebanese army actually helped protect these people, the protesters. Right. And at one point, basically, we've reached a situation today where the protesters are kind of peaceful. They have cut off almost every road in the country. They're doing kind of a blockade on the government itself and the people and other people who are not participating, so everybody can feel what's happening.
Right. Leila, something that John mentioned here right when we began was that people don't want to come out and protest. They're, of course, forced to do. It's not a recreational activity. There are costs to protesting. That's something that I want to talk about. All these people who are coming out on the streets, what is the cost of them coming out, leaving their jobs? What impact does that have?
We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in losses due to closed shops, due to closed businesses, due to the government work being hampered at one point or another. We have the central bank, which had closed down like 10 days ago, and it hasn't opened so far. People had produced checks basically to be paid. They can't clear their checks until the central bank is open, which is really crazy because there are people also waiting for their wages. But at the same time, nobody wants to be on the streets. Nobody wants to be out in the rain or in the sun and like basically just demanding their basic human rights and their basic social and economic rights. Those should have been a given thing by the government and by the country to their own people, right? So the idea is that when you are taxed and overtaxed and you find that you have no future except more debt and basically no reforms at all and you're not getting anything in return, that's when you push to the streets to actually change the matter.
Right. John, I'm going to jump back to you a little more about the need and importance of mobilization. Now, not every protest has the desired outcome, and yet people do dedicate their time, their efforts, and as we just heard about the costs that come, they incur those and still come out on the streets. But why do you think, and if you do think so, mobilization and this form of public demonstration is important?
It's very important as a first step towards a positive outcome, but there is a danger inherent in a protest movement being so heterogeneous that there is no connecting ideology. Everybody out in these streets knows what they're against, but not everybody knows what they are for. And as the saying goes, if you don't have your own agenda, you become part of someone else's. And the most chilling example of that was the outcome to the Arab Spring, which unfortunately morphed into an Arab winter, with NATO intervention in Libya, with the rise of Salafi jihadism and the monster of ISIS. The space was opened up for that process to take place by the disruption and the confusion wrought by the Arab Spring. And obviously in Egypt it came with a bad outcome there because General Sisi came into power, and it was a case of meet the new boss, same as the old boss, where he's concerned. So there are dangers inherent in mass protests when there is no connecting ideology, there is no centralised leadership. Heterogeneity is a strength for these protest movements at a certain stage because they're hard for the authorities to deal with. But at a certain stage, as I say, they must mature into a coherent movement that understands what it wants to replace the status quo that it is protesting against.
Right. Now, mentioned here that there often isn't one main goal, and something that is noticeable amongst all these protests is the fact that they are essentially leaderless. Do you think that's a change that came out in the movements and that we've seen throughout history? Movements without a central figure or an icon?
Well, if you look at the protest movements that have been successful, the most glaring example of that would be the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which became the Soviet Union in 1917. And the difference between the success of the Bolshevik Revolution there and the failure of the German Revolution, where there was an attempt to replicate the Bolshevik Revolution in Germany in 1918 after the First World War, it was the Bolshevik Party in Russia. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Kamenev, these were giants amongst the communist movement. They understood what had to be done. Lenin especially was a master tactician. He understood revolution as an art. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who comes out in these mass protests are revolutionaries or they're looking for a revolution, but at a certain point, if the status quo resists their demand for change, then it can morph and mature into a revolutionary situation. And obviously there will be people on the ground ideologically committed to revolution and trying to lead the protest movement in that direction. So it's about the group dynamic and which which leadership organically emerges and which is able to capture the hearts and minds of the people, and which is able to communicate what needs to be done in a way that people can understand and then gain the trust of the people. So there are many different factors involved in the kind of leadership that emerges. But as I say, I relate this back to the Arab Spring. What we saw there was the cause or the symptoms of a lack of leadership, the consequences of that, which were dire indeed for the whole region.
Right. Leila, talk more about this and trying to understand what really makes a protest or a movement successful. Now, you as a reporter must be covering many protests around the world, also those that took place before 2019 and those that didn't result in the desired outcome. What trends have you observed which work and which don't?
Well, basically, as John said, you need to have a centralized leadership, or at least a group of people who form a council that speak in the name of the revolution, or basically, or the riots, or the movement itself. The idea is that when it starts spontaneous and you have hundreds of thousands of people on the street and everybody has their own demand, and most of the people are talking about their personal expertise and like what's happening to them, you can't unify it in one, like basically paper, and then tell the government at one point, this is what we want. So what's needed for any movement to succeed is basically having a centralized command, or at least 3 or 4 people who can form a council that can speak in the name of that revolution or movement. And at the same time, they have to unify and filter their demands in a manner that's basically realistic. Of course, some people would be demanding things that are completely unrealistic, like the resignation of a whole parliament and the government and the president at the same time. And then basically, who's going to oversee the reforms if you're going to have all these people resign? So at one point or another, you need to have a transitional government at one point. You need to oversee new elections, and then basically you can start implementing reforms. The idea is that, as John said, it's across the world. You have revolutions that have failed because they didn't have that, and also because their demands were unrealistic, or at one point or another, it's also an element of time. Some governments bank on the element of time. People get bored after one point. They need to feed their children, so they can't stay on the streets for a long time. You can stay for like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 1 year, but for how long will you stay without any payment and feeding your children? So.
Right. Those are very important points that you've highlighted. I'm talking a little more about the demographic that makes up most of these protests we're witnessing today. We hear and read a lot about students and young activists, especially not just political protests like these, but also those that are geared towards bringing more awareness, getting governments to take stricter action against climate change. In all of these, young people play a very essential role. Do you see any specific conditions in the global environment which is causing young people to become more politically active than before?
Young people are full of idealism. They're full of belief in change, that things can get better. They haven't been bitten by life, as it were, haven't faced the kind of adversity that older people have and suffered defeats. Their expectations are higher, and they're full of theoretical ideas about how the world can change. And so this is not a new phenomenon when it comes to young people. But Leila said something very important earlier about the role of youth unemployment, specifically in the Middle East. And here, that was behind the Arab Spring in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Libya. The fact that you have an educated youth with no opportunities by which to better themselves in relation to that education. And that creates frustration, that creates a sense of hopelessness, and that creates a sense of anger. And they understand that a key component in those lack of opportunities is the way that they are governed. The corruption, dictatorship, lack of democracy, lack of ability to have free expression, to have a say in the running of the country in a meaningful way. All these things produce this cocktail of ferment which bursts out into protest movements. And I think that's what we're seeing, especially in Lebanon and the Middle East. We're seeing it in Chile. We're seeing it everywhere. It's breaking out.
Right. Just a last question to you before we let you go. Now, in all of this, how do you feel like governments have been responding throughout? One thing that is also noticeable in these protests is that there is a lot of violence. Do you feel like the reaction that governments are giving to young protesters, to protesters in large, especially in the Middle East, is very hostile?
Well, I can start basically from Lebanon and then expand throughout the Middle East. And I can tell you one thing: frustration and lack of reform and lack of hearing people's demand always causes violence and causes eruption among the people. And that's how you see violence on the streets. The idea is that it depends on the people themselves to restrain those who are rogue elements among them, to stop them from doing violence. This is what we saw in Lebanon. The first 2 days, it was kind of violent. They were trashing public and private property. They were tarnishing buildings. And then basically people started reining them in. No, our peaceful is basically peaceful. We have to target the government, not anybody else. And this is how it progressed. The idea is that the government's not listening to their people. That's the problem. It leads to a prolonged period of frustration, and that would lead to further violence going forward. Now, the idea is that basically we saw it in other countries, in Egypt, in Tunisia and Libya, and also in Lebanon. The governments never listen to their people until it's very, very late. Like towards the end, they say like, oh, now we understood you. From the beginning in Lebanon, we saw it 12 days ago, 5 days ago, and 6 days ago. The political parties, party leaders, the government leaders, the prime minister, they went out and they started talking to the people as if basically it's everybody's fault except the government. At one point or another, they said, give us a chance so we can actually implement reforms. But the people have given them about 30 years of chance to basically to do reforms.
Right.
We have a parliament speaker who hasn't said anything so far. He hasn't addressed the people yet. We have a president who had met with a few people from the protests.
I get what you're getting at here, and it's an important point that it's the frustration that builds up amongst the protesters, amongst the people, when there is this very evident disconnect between the government, the elected representatives, and the people. Thank you so much, Leila Hatoum, for joining us from Beirut. John, going back to you, I do want to understand for myself and the viewers the link between political movements and violence. There are many varying opinions regarding how valuable violence, or not valuable, but how violence is used as a tool by the protesters and by the government. A lot of literature has been written on it. What's your take on it?
It depends on the specific material conditions of any given movement, any given protest movement, any given situation of unrest, how the authorities respond. For example, in Catalonia, where I was in 2017, when the unrest began over the issue of Catalan independence, where the separatists tried to hold a referendum, which was not sanctioned by the government, they sent in riot police to club the people who were queuing up to vote in that referendum. It was a catastrophic mishandling of that situation. You saw pictures of old women being dragged by the hair by these big Kevlar helmeted riot policemen, and dragged through the streets. You had people being batoned, and this threw up echoes of the Franco dictatorship in Spain between the late 1930s and mid 1970s. And the optics of that was horrific around the world. And this was happening in the heart of Europe, in an EU member state, a so-called democracy. Ultimately, you cannot defeat an idea with batons. You can only defeat an idea with another idea, with a better idea. And if your idea is not better than the idea that is being presented or you're being confronted with, then you have to make way. But these governments don't just govern for the sake of power themselves. They govern in the interest of economic interest, the ruling class, the business elite, the financial elite, the global corporations. And this is the problem we're having, because these interests are a minority interest. They are not representative of the majority of people's lives. And this goes back to the economic factor behind all these demonstrations. They're not all disconnected. They're all to do with the same failed global free market neoliberal economic order, which essentially died.
Sorry to interrupt here, but what I want to ask you, when you're saying that they're all connected because of the global market that exists and prevails, does it become futile to protest in your isolated country when it is, of course, just one small part of a larger system?
No, there's an old saying among activists, act locally but think globally. As Malcolm X once said, you can't understand what's going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what's going on in the Congo. There is a circular relationship between local issues and wider geopolitical issues. And so you have to tailor your analysis of what's going on at home to what's going on in the wider world. And these protests can help to inspire one another, feed off each other. And, ultimately they will have to morph into a connecting thread of what is going to replace the status quo that is causing so much havoc in our lives and in our communities. And what that is the clash of ideas that will be at play. But the issue of violence is a very important one. I am not a pacifist. I don't think that all protest movements have to resort to violence, but it depends on the response of the government to that protest movement, whether it's going to be violent or not.
Right. On that, I'd also like to introduce Salah Hashimi, who's just joined us, who's a human rights lawyer and the legal advisor to the Council for Iraqi Opposition. Joins us from London. Thank you so much, Salah, for joining us. Now, when we're talking about all of this, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening all throughout the world, give us a sense of what the role the government should play in terms of protecting the protesters' human rights.
Well, first of all, I think one needs to address the root causes of these demonstrations. I think what happened since 2003, particularly in Iraq, because I have been dealing with Iraqis for some time, is the establishment of a parallel system. And that is one that is a government-established system and one that is a non-government established system, whereby armed militias have sprung up from various factions backed up by political parties who are usually trying to enforce a foreign agenda. Now, what has happened is the government has lost control, because although there may be some certain elements within the government that want to introduce reform and also protect the demonstrators, I would say that they are sometimes incapable of doing so, because of the existence of these armed militias, because they operate outside the boundaries of the law. We have recently had, in fact, within the last 24 hours, threats from certain armed militias that they will interfere if the government is threatened. They're not really saying that because the government is threatened, it's because their own interests are threatened. And therefore, the government seems to be somewhat helpless, because we have found that there are some genuine approaches by the security services towards the demonstrators in protecting them and at times even helping them. But there are also elements whom we would call imposters, who are trying to wreak havoc, who are trying to inspire that there will be a violent reaction from either peaceful demonstrators in order for the security services to react to those violent inactions and treat them with harshness. So I don't think the government, all in all, is being able to control the situation given the anger of the people on the streets.
Right. Salah, now let's talk more about what is happening in Iraq and to what you understand from why it is happening at this point in time. What do you think is essential about the timing?
Well, I think it's really repeated and several repeated failures by the government to meet the demands, the legitimate demands of the demonstrators. They have been calling upon the government to improve their conditions, to improve the status of security within the country, these services, and most importantly, to curb the endemic corruption within the country. There have been reports of horrific numbers lost to corruption in Iraq since 2003. We have had dummy institutions, such as the ones proclaiming to curb corruption, but they have been completely unable to do anything about it. Again, I go back to the existence of armed militias backed by political parties, simply because it is their own interests that they are serving, and they will not allow in any way a genuine investigation by any independent organization, and then that would be followed up naturally by the course of law, and that is the prosecution of those who are guilty.
Right.
That has happened. The demonstrators have repeated their demands for that to have happened, and it seems to be that the government either unwilling or incapable of doing so. So I don't think there is a specific reason as to the timing of the demonstrations. It is a fact that the government has repeatedly failed to meet their demands, and their demands appear to be legitimate even by the government's own admission. But
right.
As I say it, they seem to be incapable of doing anything about it.
Right. Salah, this is something that we have been talking about before you joined us as well, is that the global climate of how protests are unfolding across every region in the world, in country after country, is also inspiring other regions. Do you think that might be also the case in Iraq?
Well, it could be. If you want to trace back the roots of world revolution, you would need to go back to all the way to 1917, and that is the Russian Revolution. Your viewers may not know that out of the Russian Revolution came out two schools of thought, the Lenin School of Thought and the Trotsky School of Thought. The Lenin school of thought won the argument in that we should keep the revolution within the Russian Federation boundaries. The Trotsky idea was to inspire revolution all around the world without any borders. Now, since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, this was followed up by complete instability within the whole region, and I mean that within the Middle East. And I think it has spread slowly but gradually amongst other countries, namely particularly Syria and many other Arab countries. Is it the case that they are connected in any way? I don't think they are, but they are certainly inspired by one another. Right. Certainly there was a very famous slogan amongst Iraqi demonstrators when they first started these most recent set of demonstrations back on the 1st of October this year, is that you are no less than your fellow Egyptian demonstrators. And that inspired them to go out on the streets in vast numbers and to make their demands very well clear, not only to the government, but to the entire world.
Right. John, I'm going to go back to talk to you about something you mentioned earlier on in our discussion, and I think it's worthwhile to go back to it. The importance of social media in all of this. Now, social media connects, it inspires, and it also spreads across a message. But it is also misused by authoritarian governments and those who want to control the protests. Do you see that happening now more than ever?
The attempt to control social media. Yes, this has created a crisis within governments all across the world, including in the West. You saw the whole hysteria whipped up over Russiagate, the allegations that Russia had interfered in the 2016 US presidential election that produced Donald Trump as the president, and have had similar allegations when it comes to Brexit. And this is hysteria, unfounded claims of Russian interference. I do a lot of work with Russian media, and that's been put into that same box as a sort of nefarious actor trying to undermine the Western liberal democratic order. We saw a similar parallel with this when the Vietnam War. If you recall, some of your older viewers will recall, the footage from the Vietnam War was raw. These were not embedded journalists, and this was the advent of television, the mass availability of television. People were able to watch news at in their homes, and they were seeing the atrocities that were being committed by US forces, and this fed the anti-Vietnam War movement, which became a material force in the 1960s, and that was a big anti-Vietnam War movement in the UK as well, laying siege to the US Embassy in London at various points. And this brought into being the censorship of television news. Now we have embedded journalists. We saw this in the war in Iraq. Now I contend that if you had the multiplicity of international news channels such as your own channel, RT, various other channels that have come on board since the Iraq war, it would have been much harder for them to press ahead with the Iraq war. And despite that...
And John, sorry, since we're running short on time, that's an interesting point you make, and I want to take that and ask his opinion regarding that. Salah, what are your thoughts on what John just said?
I think I totally agree. Although there were a number of news channels that were present in Iraq, in particular, I would cite Al Jazeera, who had one of their correspondents unfortunately killed during the first days of the occupation of Baghdad. And that, of course, caused a huge big stir within the media sector and the population itself. Now, unfortunately, there are, as I said, there are imposters within the demonstrators who are putting or publicizing false news in the hope that somebody might rely on that news or those video clips, if you like, and then they are named and shamed as being spreading false news about what's happening on the ground. So people need to be extremely careful about what they publicize, because some of this news is false and some of it is being put out falsely and deliberately in order to mask what's happening on the ground. So although the internet and information technologies is an extremely useful tool to publicize what's happening on the ground, each person with a mobile phone is in fact a correspondent of his own. However, one needs to be extremely cautious about what to relay and what to publicize, because that could be used against them.
Right. On that point, I'd like to thank Salah Hashimi for joining us and John Wight for joining us for this very interesting discussion. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, as Kashmir enters the 85th day of a complete blanket curfew placed on it, news flows in regarding how the Kashmiri narrative has been and is being silenced online. A report released by the international organization Committee to Protect Journalists states that close to 1 million tweets have been blocked by Twitter at India's behest. Let's discuss this in greater detail. Joining us for this discussion is Ramsha Jahangir, tech journalist and human rights activist. She joins us from Karachi. Also joining us is Yasir Ahmed, who's an analyst, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ramsha, I'd like to begin with you. Now, take us through the details of what the findings of the Committee to Protect Journalists report stated. What were the main highlights in it regarding what is being done in regards to Kashmir's narrative?
CPJ found that in total there were 53 letters sent by the Indian government to Twitter that asked to block all or part of 400 accounts during the period they analyzed, which was of 2 years. In August alone, which is 2019, there were 9 legal requests sent to Twitter, specifying 20 accounts and 24 tweets, which were all in majority of them which concerned content on Twitter, on Kashmir.
Right. Now, in all of this, let's try to understand how much leverage or how much power a government does have over the content that can be displayed on social media. Now, give us a sense of that. How much say does the government have in telling Twitter or Facebook to restrict access to certain content?
So it's interesting that Twitter releases its transparency reports twice in a year. And if we look at the past transparency reports for India, so Twitter's compliance hasn't exactly been all, it's just been at 2%. But what's interesting is, and one of the interesting findings of the same report that we're discussing is that in recent times, there has been more pressure from the Indian government, particularly in the last year or two, and there has been a spike in requests from India. So there is, of course, a lot of pressure from India on Twitter. And I wouldn't say that Twitter exactly is taking in all the pressure, but the fact that the majority of the content taken down has been on Kashmir, it kind of creates this doubt and this, it does put Twitter into question if it's aiding India's quest to censor Kashmir or not.
Right. And Ramsha, we're going to talk about this in greater depth, but I'd like to bring Yasir into this conversation and talk to him about how he sees what is happening online when we talk about Kashmir. What is the narrative flowing? Does he feel like there is censorship? Give us your thoughts, Yasir.
Kashmiri's right to self-determination is non-negotiable. And I myself run an online digital newspaper called Kashmir Insider. So this has not been happening now, because all the celebrities and politicians across the world come on Twitter and there were like millions of followers. Now this has come into the limelight. But if you go back to 2017, 2018, Facebook did something really very simple. So what governments, hyper-nationalist, people who follow hyper-nationalism, what they are trying to do, IT cells that countries run across the world, they just want to, curb freedom of speech, and a different narrative, a difference of opinion is not allowed. And what happens because of this is the world they get validity because there's no one that is countering them.
Yeah, sir. Now, as we're talking about what is happening in terms of there being an effort to curb the narrative regarding Kashmir, the fact that Kashmir is still under a draconian lockdown, the fact that it still has a media and a communications blackout, do you think that in itself is seen as a huge problem by the world and that has solidified the narrative which favors Kashmir?
Well, if we look around the world, I don't think Kashmiris ever got frontline space in New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, Independent, across the world. Definitely people, internationally, they know what is happening in Kashmir. They exactly know the kind of atrocities that Indian occupation forces are committing in Kashmir. If you look at United Nations Human Rights Commissioner's report that was, published last year, it explained exactly what was happening in Kashmir. So the Kashmiri's narrative is there, but India, and the cells that BJP is running, which has been headed by Arvinder Gupta on Ashok, which is located on Ashok Road, Delhi. People like them who've been, who are under, the supervision of Narendra Modi himself, what they are trying to do is they don't want your narrative to be floated internationally, so that, the lesser you speak, the more they can show the world that everything is normal in Kashmir. So, whatever false stories, they are going to publish, they'll get validity.
Right. Ramsha, going back to our conversation earlier and talking about how you also stated that there is a seemingly greater effort by India to clamp down on tweets coming out regarding Kashmir and whether or not Twitter is complying to it. Now, a lot of people believe that there is a Twitter bias there. Is there any evidence or proof of that?
So if you look at, again, I would come back to the transparency reports, because that is the only data that Twitter releases. Otherwise, in engagement, whenever Twitter is approached to comment personally, and I think in the investigation also, when the Twitter's response is that they're not biased and they maintain impartiality, and then that they're that they're not going to compromise on freedom of expression. However, it's interesting to see that these accounts that have been taken down, and like I said, 400 accounts is a big number, with a majority, with posting majority of content on Kashmir. And then in recent times, our government also specified around 200 accounts to Twitter, which was suspended for posting on Kashmir. So suspensions are taking place, and which is exactly what puts Twitter's policies in question and puts them accountable for what exactly is going on. Is it just lack of cultural context, or lack of economic interest in Pakistan or Kashmir, or is it because India
Ramsha, sorry to interrupt you. I do want you to explain that in greater depth. When you say lack of economic interest within Pakistan or Kashmir, and how that would impact content that is being displayed online.
India is a great market for Twitter and social media platforms, because and Twitter has a local presence in India as well, but it does not in Pakistan. So obviously, India is generating profit, and Twitter is getting revenue out of India. So the economic interests are there. However, the problem is not just economic interest here. There's also more representation in Twitter headquarters. So in all these social media tech companies, for instance, South Asia is handled mostly by Indian employees. So that also puts a certain amount of bias when they're moderating content, and there is no representation from Pakistan on these platforms. So obviously there is that as well, apart from economic interest. But one can't be exactly too sure with what's going on. That is lack of transparency on Twitter's part, and they do not want to comment in detail. But I think this report gives enough evidence to show that suspensions are happening, content is being taken down, and about time Twitter should be answerable.
Right. It does indeed put a great question mark on the entire situation here. And as you said, Twitter should be more responsive to what is happening and should answer to the questions being raised. Yasir, on this point, I do want to talk about the social media campaign that has been trying to raise the issue of Kashmir. How powerful do you feel that it has been?
Well, I'll give you a small example, and of my own e-newspaper, KashmirInsider.com. When we started it, after Burhan Wani was killed by Indian security forces in 2016, 2017, we started Kashmir Insider just to counter the Indian narrative. And because what was being published in our news portal online was what was happening in the valley, which depicted the true picture of all the events that were happening. The Kashmir Insider went viral. And in 2019, Facebook did, they changed things in their system, and again, it affected us. Our reach was limited.
Right.
What Twitter did today, Facebook did yesterday. In 2018.
Right.
Now, Kashmiris themselves, if the diaspora is not that huge, especially people from Indian-occupied Kashmir. They are not in numbers. whatever has been, been done internationally, it has been done online, through online campaigns. And I think that is the only source that we have of any news, coming out, because India does not allow any international body to go there, or a fact-finding mission to Kashmir.
Right. And Yasir, on that, I will have to end the show, but that's an important point that you're making, that social media in this regard is essential, because at this moment in time, while there is complete lack of access to Kashmir, what is happening there, information, social media is what is spreading news, is what is creating awareness. On that point, I'd like to thank Ramsha Jahangir for joining us from Karachi and Yasir Ahmed for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.